Donald Trump just renamed Lake Ontario. Yes, Lake Ontario, one of the 5 Great Lakes. According to the U.S. government, it is now called Lake America. And Canada? Canada isn't buying it. So we have a pretty unusual situation. The same lake, the same water, the same border, but 2 different names. And that raises a much bigger question. Why would the President of the United States spend political capital renaming a lake? Because this isn't really a story about a lake. It's a story about Canada. And it's a story about how Donald Trump uses symbols, pressure, and political theater to send a message. Let's start with what actually happened. On August 27th, Donald Trump signed an executive order directing the U.S. government to rename Lake Ontario as Lake America. The order tells the Department of the Interior to update the name in the U.S. Geographic Names Information System. So, yes, for the U.S. federal government, the lake now has a new name. But here's the catch. Trump didn't rename the lake for the entire world. He can't. He didn't move the border. He didn't acquire the Canadian half of the lake. And he certainly can't order Canada to start calling it Lake America. For Canadians, it's still Lake Ontario. And that's where this gets interesting. Because Lake Ontario isn't some obscure body of water sitting entirely inside the United States. It is shared by the United States and Canada. Toronto sits on its northern shore. New York State sits on the southern shore. Millions of Americans and Canadians live around it. The lake connects the 2 countries economically, geographically, and historically. And now Washington is calling it one thing, while Ottawa is calling it another. Think about how strange that is. Imagine driving across the border with a map in your car. On one side, it says Lake Ontario. On the other side, it says Lake America. Same lake, different politics. And if you think this is just a joke, look at the timing. The United States and Canada are already locked in a serious political and economic confrontation. Trump has repeatedly criticized Canada. He's imposed tariffs. He's threatened more. He's talked about Canada's economic relationship with the United States as if Washington has been getting the short end of the deal. And, of course, Trump has repeatedly floated the idea of Canada becoming the 51st state. Canadian leaders have rejected that idea. And Canadians, judging by the reaction, aren't exactly lining up to apply for American citizenship. So when Trump suddenly puts the word America on a lake shared with Canada, it's difficult to see it as completely disconnected from that larger fight. This is the part one find most interesting. Trump understands that politics isn't only about laws, budgets, and treaties. Politics is also about symbols. Names matter. Maps matter. Words matter. A name can be a political statement. We've already seen this with the Gulf of Mexico. The Trump administration began using the name Gulf of America for federal purposes. Now the same logic has reached the Great Lakes. Lake America. The message is almost impossible to miss. America, America, and more America. That doesn't mean the physical consequences are enormous. They're not. The lake isn't getting bigger. The United States isn't gaining new territory. Canada isn't losing a square mile. No trade agreement has changed. No tariff has disappeared. But that's not really the point. The point is political messaging. And Trump is exceptionally good at political messaging. He knows how to take something that would normally be a technical issue and turn it into a national conversation. And that's exactly what has happened here. We're not talking about a bureaucratic update to a geographic database. We're talking about Donald Trump renaming Lake Ontario. That's a headline. That's television. That's social media. And that's attention. Now, there's another question we need to answer. Can Trump actually rename the lake? The answer is both yes and no. Yes, he can direct the U.S. federal government to use a different name. That's what the executive order does. But no, he cannot force Canada to recognize that name. He can't tell Canadian government agencies what to put on their maps. He can't change Canada's geographic naming conventions. And he can't dictate what people in Toronto are going to call the lake. That's the important distinction. Trump can change the name inside the U.S. federal government. He cannot change the name inside Canada. And that means we could end up with something almost comical. 2 governments looking at the same lake and using different names. But there is actually something more serious underneath the comedy. Because Canada sees this as another example of Washington asserting itself over a relationship that has traditionally been based on close cooperation. And that relationship is changing. Canada is America's closest neighbor, a NATO ally, a major trading partner, a critical source of energy and raw materials. The two economies are deeply integrated. Cars, oil, electricity, agriculture, manufacturing. The relationship is enormous. So when relations between Washington and Ottawa become confrontational, the consequences can go far beyond political rhetoric. And that is why the Lake America story matters. Not because the name of the lake is going to transform North America. It won't. It matters because it is another piece of a much larger political pattern. Trump is telling Canada that the old relationship is changing, and he's doing it in a language that his political base understands immediately. American strength, American sovereignty, American interests, and, above all, America first. There's also an interesting historical irony here. Lake Ontario existed long before the United States. It existed long before modern Canada. The Great Lakes themselves were there long before today's borders were drawn. The lake doesn't belong to Donald Trump. It doesn't belong to Mark Carney. It doesn't belong to Washington. And it doesn't belong to Ottawa. Governments came later. Borders came later. Political arguments came later. The water was already there. And that makes the decision to rename it politically fascinating. Because changing a name doesn't change history. It changes the story people are being asked to tell about that place. And this is where Trump's strategy becomes clearer. He doesn't necessarily need a policy to create a political effect. Sometimes he just needs a symbol, a headline, a provocative phrase, something people will argue about at dinner, on television, and online. And Lake America is perfect for that. Trump supporters can look at it and say, why shouldn't America call an American geographic feature whatever it wants? His critics can look at it and say, this is unnecessary provocation against Canada. And Canadians can look at the whole thing and simply say, we're still calling it Lake Ontario. Everyone gets a political message. And everyone keeps talking about Donald Trump. Which brings us to perhaps the strangest part of this story. Trump has apparently joked about going even further. If America can have the Gulf of America and Lake America, why not an ocean? The Atlantic? The Pacific? At that point, the whole thing sounds almost like satire. But don't miss the pattern. Trump repeatedly uses geography as a political language. A place name becomes a statement of identity. A map becomes a political document. And a seemingly minor change becomes a way of talking about power. That's what makes this story bigger than a lake. Because the real question isn't, what should we call Lake Ontario? The real question is, who gets to define the political map? And that question matters far beyond Canada. For decades, Americans have largely assumed that the country's closest neighbors were also its most predictable partners. Canada was different. Canada was the ally next door. The country you didn't have to worry about. The border you could cross without thinking about geopolitics. The relationship that seemed almost automatic. Trump has challenged that assumption. And whether you support him or oppose him, that is a significant change. The United States and Canada are now having arguments that would have seemed extraordinary only a few years ago. Tariffs, trade, sovereignty, energy, the future of North American economic integration. And now, the name of a lake. So has Donald Trump really renamed Lake Ontario? For the U.S. federal government, yes. For Canada, no. For the rest of the world? That's another question entirely. But here's what definitely changed. The lake became a political symbol. And perhaps that's exactly what Donald Trump wanted. Because the water hasn't moved. Toronto is still on the northern shore. New York is still on the southern shore. The border is still where it was yesterday. But now Washington says, Lake America, and Ottawa says, Lake Ontario. Same lake, same continent, same border, different politics. And that may tell us more about the current relationship between the United States and Canada than the name itself ever could.